The confirmation class and I have been getting together almost every Sunday morning since last September to talk about so much, about faith and science, about the church, about the Bible, about theology, about ethics, about Jesus, about history, occasionally about Formula One racing and rowing, about school, about life. One Sunday, I might start out talking about the Wesleyan quadrilateral, and if you don't know what that is, talk to us afterwards. Might move to John Wesley and how he challenged slavery and labor practices in 18th century England, and very quickly the students were making connections to homelessness and the struggle for LGBTQIA plus rights and civil rights. And I have to say that y'all have raised some very astute and wise young people in Hannah and Ginny and Rocco and Brandon and Judith. They and you should be very, very proud. As we got to the place of talking about creeds and statements of faith, I started taking notes of our conversations and the wonderings and observations of the class. Some of the questions were amazing. Is Jesus' call to radical forgiveness still practical? Does it work? Can my faith guide my sense of purpose as I choose my career? Do all churches encourage self-reflection and exploration by its young people? Why do some Christians think that their tradition is the only way to God? We covered a great breadth of topics with, I hope, reasonable depth as well. And it was all hard to boil it down to a cogent faith statement for us to share today.
So this week we came upon an article by Alan Bean in Baptist Global News. And he was talking about Jonathan Rauch, who has recently published a book called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Rauch is a lot of things. He's the senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and also a contributing editor at The Atlantic magazine.
He's a smart guy, yeah.
He's also gay. He's also Jewish. He's also an atheist. And he totally loves Jesus. Or,
wait, what? I know.
To be more accurate, he totally loves Jesus' teachings as he finds them in the New Testament. And Rauch distills Jesus' core teaching down to 3 bullet points.
Which I was not able to do with the class.
That's right. And this is what they are. Don't be afraid. Imitate Jesus. Forgive each other. Those 3 things. And he says that the American church, all versions of it, left and right, while most faith communities are very loving within their communities, often the American church has lost these 3 things in engaging with the world outside the church.
According to Alan Bean, Jonathan Rauch argues that the demise of the mainline Protestant church, and that's us, was because we became what he called thin. After 1950, thin Christianity stopped talking about the centrality of Jesus. It stopped talking about public virtue. It stopped talking about the life to come, about the great biblical drama of sin and redemption. The mainline church has been fine with Jesus' ethical example, but we've drifted away from being able to talk outside the building about how our relationship with Jesus is at the core of all that we do and all that we are. And over the second half of the 20th century, Rausch claims that it became harder and harder to see a distinction between the values and statements of our mainline churches and the values and culture of the center-left of secular America. As the mainline pulled away from overt public religiosity, we became what Rausch calls a thin faith.
And Rausch contrasts that with the conservative evangelical Christianity in this country that loves to talk about Jesus and, as heirs of Southern slaveholding theology, has been loath to imitate or live out Jesus' teachings and social ethics, at least outside the church building. Conservative evangelical Christianity in the 1970s began to align itself more and more closely with the secular far right and has come to embrace a politicized and confrontational and divisive approach to the world. Rausch says that these churches are not thin, but are sharp. They feed on fear and resentment at times and can wield Christianity as a weapon.
Rausch argues that when it comes to connecting with the larger American culture, both thin liberal and sharp conservative Christianities have strayed from the core of their faith and leaned instead into the binary categories of secular politics. In opposite directions, into conservative and liberal and left and right and blue and red and progressive and MAGA, until we don't understand each other anymore. And frankly, we don't particularly want to, because we're all very comfortable in our little bubble, thank you very much. We can't figure out how to live together as people of faith or as citizens of a democracy. As an outsider looking in, Rausch is far more concerned about the state of our democracy than he is about the health of American Christianity per se. But, he says, the problem and the solution are intimately intertwined. Rausch says that historically, Christianity has been a load-bearing wall in American democracy. And it is weakened, and it is falling down, and it'll take democracy with it.
What's interesting is when he looks forward, Rausch doesn't side with thin Christianity or sharp Christianity. What he wants to see is what he calls a thick Christianity. He wants Christians to be more like Jesus, more loving, more forgiving, more merciful, more believable, more compelling. We don't need churches to tell people how to vote, he says. We do need to teach Christians how to comport themselves in the political arena as people of faith and goodwill. Don't be afraid. Imitate Jesus and forgive each other, he says.
You might want to write that down.
So when he says don't be afraid, Rausch is looking for a church that doesn't let fear push it into looking for secular heroes, secular saviors from the right or the left. He's looking for a church that knows where it stands.
And when he says to imitate Jesus, he is looking for a church that is so like Jesus that it sees how each and every individual has intrinsic worth. A church so like Jesus that people are never used as a means to an end. A church so like Jesus that there is no justification for violating these values, even if your political or religious enemy does.
And when he speaks about forgiving each other, Rausch believes that the radical forgiveness that Jesus taught is the only basis for a world that does not decay into violence and revenge. He's looking for a faith that isn't trying to drive out or scapegoat or demonize its opponents, but is trying to live with them in pluralism.
So Rausch is looking for a thick faith for American Christians. A thick faith. We never used that term in confirmation class, mostly because I hadn't read the term until last week. But I think that is precisely what our confirmation class has been trying to describe for themselves as they talked about what is important to them and their faith. They've been looking for a thick faith.
So as we've said approximately 57 times already today is Pentecost. It's the birthday of the church, not quite 2,000 years ago. We tell again the story, we heard the story from August this morning about God's wind coming upon a group of fearful disciples that weren't quite sure what they were supposed to be doing, and how that Spirit came in a rush of wind and with tongues of flame and empowered them to speak the words that people needed to hear the good news. And that infant church quickly became a group of people that shared a common faith, a thick faith that they lived out in a community that shared all things in common, that reached out across all of the boundaries of race and class and gender and social status of their day, where all people were in leadership, not just the traditional folk. Those early Christians received the gifts of the Spirit and fiercely loved each other and fearlessly forgave each other. They did the best they could to live like Jesus together. And because they did, we can say, Happy birthday, church.
And today, some 1995 years later, we are going to celebrate a group of fearless young people who are ready to bring a thick faith to today's beautiful and terrible and fragile and resilient world.